Okay, everyone, it is time to get started here to our workshop on nuclear weapons and racism. Just first on the Q&A for today's workshop, the chat function is going to be reserved for your questions. So as your facilitator, I'll read them aloud, but if you want to ask a question, please write it into the chat. And without further ado, we'll get started. I'm going to have two presenters today. Jim Anderson, who is a deeply engaged in intersectional organizing across issue areas. He's the president of Peace Action New York State and is the state vice president of Citizen Action of New York. He is a founding member and organizer of the National Black United Front, which led the formation of the Third World and Progressive People's Coalition, which helped organize the June 12, 1982 disarmament rally in New York City at the UN. Jim also served as an organizer and leader for the peace contentions of both the 2014 NYC and 2017 DC climate marches. Our second presenter will be Benedict Kabul Madison, and he is the project specialist for youth, climate, and nuclear issues at the Marshallese Educational Initiative, a nonprofit organization that serves the Marshallese community, raises awareness of Marshallese culture, and facilitates intercultural dialogue to foster positive social change. For more than a decade, Benedict has worked with his peers and Marshallese students and their families on projects to increase retention rates and to promote Marshallese culture and history, as well as on issues affecting his people and his homeland. He was the keynote speaker at the 12SL annual conference in October 19, where he spoke about the impact of climate change in the Marshall Islands. Take it away.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and maybe I dare say still morning somewhere else. But anyway, greetings all. And well, this is a great subject, and this is going to be easy. We done had all the policy stuff presented earlier today, and even this has some policy to it, but I'm going to bring it in a different way. Because when we come to moments like this, it's about really doing things that can move the needle. And I know that we didn't come here for entertainment. We're here for entertainment. And I tend to push. I may poke you, so maybe I should have you say, ouch, because some of what I say will push at us, not just you, even myself. So when we look at the issue of nuclear weapons and racism, there are three things that I think we should focus on. One is the knowledge, the cost, and the connections. Now, I'd say those, but I want to give you some of the background of why I come to that. When Dr. King spoke at Riverside Church, as you remember, he was leading the Poor People's Campaign at that time. And when he spoke there, one of the things that he recognized right from Jump Street is that the monies that poor people needed was going into the war effort. The anti-war movement that was going on at the time was important because what it did do, it allowed us to raise the fact that when it comes to war, monies needed for poor people are going there. And he recognized that. So he saw the connection, but if you know the history, you know what happened. Not everybody saw the connection. Many Black organizations did not recognize the connection. In fact, it was once said by some that peace and civil rights don't go together. I use that as the pivot point for saying how we got lost, how we got stuck, and how we failed to do the things that would have us in a better position. And here's why. Because during that time also, let's be clear, the elements of racism was very different. And even those who were not of color, those who were white, let's be honest, the ability to blend, to not be affected by it, to practice, that's not me, I don't do that, I wouldn't do that, was present too. Yes, there were activists who were very clear, but let me just tell you, the roots of racism and at that time was very strong. Now, fast forward to now. What has happened since then? We've been on a steady procession to making change. around the race elements. And we get here now in our immediate time, and what do you hear people saying? They're saying in organizations, we need more young people and more people of color. Well, they didn't just get to the planet. And why are we just now getting here after all that time talking about we need that particular group? What is the reason why we didn't bring them with us? And I'm not going to say it was out of design. Some of it was. A lot of it was out of ignorance, unaddressed ignorance, because the struggle we wage today was going on then. As I talk, I'm going to be skipping around, so I hope you stay with me, and when we get to Q&A, take me on some of this. So from Dr. King, the elements of those who knew how connected foreign policy to the struggles that were going on here in the USA, some of them were considered extremists. Some of them were, but not all of them. And there was some great knowledge and some great efforts made to connect the dots. And here we are now in what we call an intersectional moment, and we're still trying to connect the dots, which is good, but we have to look at why the dots weren't connected anyway. Remember I said knowledge? At the time that a lot of these efforts were going on, no one was making the connections at the community level about how the knowledge of what foreign policy does and affects their local economy, in fact, even their personage, to help them understand that they were a stakeholder in what the US does, not only at home, but abroad. Little work was done investing that in communities of color. The ones who were picking it up were the more activist groups in the communities of color. And sometimes they were challenged because they didn't always have linkage to the best, the information. They had linkage to people, and they had some connections to people in other land who revealed, and the struggle and its natural growth picked up those elements. But in the mainstream, that didn't happen. That's why we're a little bit off guard with this whole immigration thing, because in that element of racism, it wasn't just black and white. It had red, it had yellow, it had brown. They had various targeting people. So I say that for us not to ignore the fact that we come from a ignorant time in our culture that was doing some bad things and hurt a lot of people. But now that we're in this restorative moment, we have to look at restoration in a broader range. We look at the community level, but it's not just our communities here in the nation, it's the communities of the world. When we look around the world, it is communities who are poor, who are striving not only for the economics they need, but for the opportunities they need, and who it is striving against and facing, trying to block them off, greedy corporate hands, and wayward politicians who are lost or either surrendered their statesmanship. Now, so what has happened? This oncoming wave of what many describe as young people, and by the way, young is not just a low number age. Young is a mindset also, and Stevie Wonder would say, keep in the key of life, because the key of life will keep you young. But what I'm trying to say is that this oncoming wave are the bearers of the new knowledge and the new skills. And they know stuff, and they've been exposed to stuff that enlighten them so much more than we give them respect for. And we deal with the new youngins like we deal with people of color and racism. Same kind of games. Play you down, dismiss you, use you, but don't really invest in you at certain times, yeah. And so what's happening is that as we change the infrastructure of how our policies are made to be more humane and to be in line with the call for today, ridding the world of nuclear weapons, we are also in a moment of changing organizational structure, because this generation coming on represents what one could say is the same kind of dynamic that clean, renewable energy represents in the energy corridor. This new knowledge, this new way of thinking, this creativity that is so unloosed, but yet so brilliant and ready to take the helm.
Greetings to everyone. My presentation today is about the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, and we'll also talk about COVID-19 and how it has affected the Marshallese community and how it relates to the nuclear history. So prior to testing nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands, the islands were under Japanese control until the Americans pushed them out in World War II. And shortly after, the US asked the United Nations if they could administer the islands under an agreement called the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. So basically asking other outsiders if they could colonize the Marshall Islands. So why did the US choose Marshall Islands for nuclear testing? Well, as former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger once said, there are only 90,000 people there. Who gives a damn? That pretty much sums up the government's attitude towards Marshallese in the 40s and 50s, and honestly, even today. And so the US needed a place far away from continents for secrecy and far away to reduce radiation exposure to American citizens. But what about our Marshallese elders and ancestors at the time? Were their lives not worth it? Well, obviously not, because the American government saw them as inferior or uncivilized. In other words, they did not want to view them as people, but rather as lab rats to justify or defend their sick, demented reasons to use our islands and bodies for the good of mankind and to end all wars. And so the United States chose Bikini and Eniwetok atolls to test 67 nuclear weapons, or equivalent to 7,200 Hiroshima bombs. And they removed the Bikinians on March 7, 1946, and promised them that their exile would only be temporary. Now, 75 years later, Bikini is still not safe to live on. And although the islanders did not want to leave, you know, what do you do when all you have are rocks and sticks, but the other guy has guns? And so they removed 167 Bikinians, left them on an uninhabited island, and several weeks later, they were starving. And the US didn't even bother to check on them. Yet one of the stipulations under the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands Agreement was that the US will care for the well-being of the Marshallese people, which also includes the Bikinian. And so TTPI would become another broken treaty. And you know, how many treaties between the US and Native communities has the US not honored? Plenty. You know, broken racist treaties, as we all know, benefits the United States. And of course, the picture on the top left is another example of the US government's attitudes towards Marshallese. American officials smiling and celebrating the nuclear testing program with a mushroom cake while the Bikinians were starving. Next slide, please. And so this week, 67 years ago, the US conducted its largest and most powerful nuclear weapon, the Castle Bravo. The weapon picked up 3 islands into the atmosphere or vaporized them. And several hours later, fallout from Castle Bravo reached Rongelap Atoll. And the people there thought it was snow. And you see, land to us Marshallese, we consider it to be gold. And we say that because land area in the Marshall Islands is only 70 square miles scattered across 1 million square miles of ocean. And so our livelihood depends on the land, and the land is a vocal part of Marshallese culture. But the US government did not see it that way. They saw our islands as barren lands for testing, and because they were scattered, they can forcibly move people around easily. it was prejudice thinking. And so the people on Rongola and other communities would eventually develop illnesses that were foreign to their bodies. We Marshallese were once healthy. We Marshallese were once a healthy population, and today we have some of the highest rates of cancer and other nuclear related diseases. Next slide, please. And so around June and July of last year, Marshallese accounted for about 50% of the deaths here in Northwest Arkansas. And even though Marshallese only make up 3% of the population in our region of 500,000. And around the same time, Marshallese accounted for 10% of the deaths in the state. And in the next slide, we will look at all the reasons as to why we had so many positive cases in the Marshallese community. So COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the Marshallese because one, the mixed messaging between state and federal officials confused the community. And we Marshallese are religious, so people had to choose between listening to science and medical experts or politicians who claim to be on the side of God. But thankfully, the majority of the community chose to listen to sound minds. Other reasons include there being no safety net here in this country, and people depend on jobs that don't pay thriving wages. They depend on jobs that don't respect human rights, jobs that sees workers as expendable. And many Marshallese families live in multi-generational homes because it's affordable for many of us, and because that is the way of our culture. We are a close-knit community. We like being together. And of course, the health issue that we have inherited from the nuclear testing puts us at a higher risk of getting COVID-19 and dying from it. And as mentioned earlier, we have some of the highest rates of cancer. We also have some of the highest rates of diabetes, hypertension, and other nuclear-related diseases in the world. But unlike cancer, diabetes and other chronic illnesses didn't start until the Marshallese diet began to change due to the destruction of our lands and oceans from nuclear testing. And so our dependence on food import grew. Food such as ramen, ramen noodle, canned food, and many other unhealthy poisons that the US said we should eat. And now Marshallese used to be eligible for Medicaid until 1996, when Medicaid reforms were made. And even after Congress realized what they did not restore Medicaid for us until 25 years later in December of last year. So yet again, the United States did not honor their commitment to care for the health of Marshallese people. And so not having access to health insurance discouraged a lot of Marshallese from going to the doctors because of the high medical bills they end up with. And so how does all of this relate to the nuclear history? Well, honestly, if it hadn't been for the nuclear testing program, we would not have had all these health issues. We would not have had to experience the systemic problems that we're experiencing today in this country. And then the last slide is this mural painting was done by the Reverse the Trend to commemorate Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day on Monday. I thought it was fitting to share it today because it shows more than just a painting of Castle Bravo. It was created by the hands from the face of the earth by nuclear weapons. But despite all that my people have been through, we are still here today. I have hope that my generation and generations of Marshallese to come And because we have something our oppressors did not want our elders or ancestors to use, and that's our voices. And so we will continue to use our voices to demand justice for our people and to advocate for a livable planet for all. Thank you.
Okay, before we dismissed each other, I was about to mention Vincent Intandi's book, African Americans Against the Bomb. That's African Americans Against the Bomb by Vincent Intandi, Intondi, a worthy read. Now I'm going to go in and say, remember I said knowledge, costs, and connecting. You just heard Benedict talk to the thing about knowledge that I want to highlight. What was happening to the Marshallese is unknown by many of us. In fact, what happened in Hiroshima is unknown still by many folks. And it's the value of that knowledge. And I tell you what else is unknown, how the cost impact has infected poor communities here in the US. Remember I said Dr. King made the connection with the Poor People's Campaign? But we stayed disconnected in the silos for so long, we just arrived to this point where we talk about doing away with siloism of just a few years ago. And we got the verbiage, but we don't have the behavior yet. We got slogans, but we don't have the actions that would make those slogans really powerful. For instance, if somebody said to you, Black Lives Matter, and you say it, but then they're gonna say, so what do you do to show that? See, there are actions we can do that feel good, but there are other actions we can do that move the needle and that are of a necessity more than just to feel good. And for instance, what was happening in the Marshall Islands? When you think about what was going on in the Marshall Islands and its connection to militarization, think about us now running around here telling many military guys, thank you for your service. What are you thanking them for? Many of us carried out orders and actions that we didn't understand the connection to the human quality or the planet. But now we're at a new point, and this oncoming generation are the bearers and helping us to stay up with them as they learn the newness. And remember, we got here coming through pain onto protests, and now we're moving into power. Pain, the pain is, you just heard what Benedict said. If you ask the people of Japan, they'll tell you. If you ask the people of South Korea, of the Koreas, they will tell you. Many countries that have suffered at our wagging our muscle around not only the threat of nuclear weapons, but the threat of really doing stuff that would harm them. We don't hear about it until what, 50 years later when they break out the annals of what a president might have, what was said behind doors. I'm just saying that's the kind of ignorance we have to break down that wall and understand the knowledge. We got to learn about each other. So here we are already in diverse communities, but then ask yourself, when's the last time you organized in a different community on an issue that we're all stakeholders in? That's what we have to prepare ourselves to do. But you can't do that without first acknowledging what you know. You can't do what you don't know. So what does it mean in our meeting? It means in our meeting, if we're serious about connecting nuclear weapons and racism and understanding this impact, we have to discuss it in our own meetings. And not only discuss it in our meetings, we have to role play, and we have to share within our meeting, leaning on each other, our own need to, and I don't want to call it repent, but to forgive ourselves for not being active enough when it was going down and we saw it. We didn't know how to be active, but we had a better state, and we got to be active, because those who are building to get rich on hurting humanity and the planet, we have to stop them. Some are crazy, some are greedy, some are just plain sick. I'm gonna stop there. I think you could feel my drift, but I want to say that the knowledge, the cost, and the connections are important. I can't stop there. The cost, we know how much money we want to waste on replenishing the nuclear arsenal. We know how much money we don't gave away to these so-called contractors overseas on our behalf. and now we're realizing that, hey, that's too much money. When we look at the discretionary budget, we see how much money goes to that effort that we don't know why. We ain't war, and where we need the money, why not? And guess what's on the horizon? Just the other day on NPR, there's a thrust where they're trying to make a case that nuclear energy be what sustains the space program, opening up a new challenge to our wisdom to be able to articulate against that before people get that romance for these things. I'm gonna stop here, but there's a lot more to say about it, because when you go into communities, I keep saying I'm gonna stop, right? When you go into communities, how are you gonna link this issue to those who are concerned about whether it's climate, whether it's immigration, whether it's education, whether it's health? We need to practice that in our ranks and go out and help others to understand the connection, and we'll see the kind of movement we need in order to rid the world of nuclear weapons, and we'll be doing the work of creating a culture of peace. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So folks, you can write questions in the chat, or you just write question in the chat, and we will take you. We have 15 minutes and we want to have a discussion here. I'm going to kick it off with a question for Jim, because you were there back in the day. I've heard about this 1982 Peace March for forever. 100,000 people or a million people, right, in New York protesting nuclear weapons and calling for the freeze. And I understand Dr. Ntandi's writing a book talking about how a good half of that group were in fact people of color. And yet here we are today having these conversations. I think the word you were looking for is reckoning. That is what is upon us now, particularly in this movement. We won't be affected. We can't go into lobby meetings with all one kind of people. We have to have a nuclear disarmament movement that looks like America, that looks like this country and its diversity. So my question for you is, what happened between,
Well,
I mean, since you've been around, like, how did that go to this?
Well, how we got lost. I mean, look, that was a time people didn't want to be called names. So, because of the racism, in fact, there were groups, if you worked with a group that wasn't of your culture, you might be called a sellout, Uncle Tom. You may, and those of you who are not of color, you'll be called some names also. I'm just saying, we have to understand the names that will be called now, and because some of that they have upgraded and will be said, but that affected people. Because remember, we weren't as wise as we are in understanding how these things impact us. I mean, we didn't have the kind of technology and information that could help us refute them. What we knew is the damage that happened. Like, you hear people always talking about Tuskegee, right? It's the misinformation that is not being challenged by the liberating and the forward pushing information. That was in our ranks. We didn't do that. And I just have to tell you that we have a chance to do it now. We can't, everything is on the table for us. You see this sign that says to change everything, we need everyone. Well, we need every idea. And we need the creative element of some of what these issues we deal with. We need to be framing it even in comics. With so many people embracing comics, where is our comic character who is expressing the verbiage about doing away nuclear weapons, save the world? Hey, don't we have some illustrators that could get that in the flow? It cuts both ways, because you got adults and young people rocking with comics. You see it on TV. So I'm just saying, use the vehicles to get in there. We didn't go into communities of color, and I'll end because I won't be much longer on this. We didn't go too much into communities of color because what? The kind of things that have been featured about them. Well, we want to be where they're down for action, but that became like just going to a concert and then leaving, because you were coming from community where many of the perpetrators of the negativity in the culture was where you live. And we're just beginning to recognize that. That's why we're here, where we look for whites to stand up against racism, where they at, and against those who look like them. anyway, that's all part of it. The new knowledge, the learning that has come and has come out of pain, because we had to hear somebody crying and testifying before we could respond.
Thank you. We have a question from Gina Salazar, who says, I know, and I think Benedict, you can unmute yourself and you both can jump in on this. One's not directed to either one of you. I know some people who feel threatened by activism promoting racial or socioeconomic equality and inclusion because they're part of a group that's not represented by the activism. I want the friends to see how activism can benefit their group also, so they feel the movement belongs to them too. Any suggestions for how I can start this?
I'll let you go first. I definitely got a response. That's right down my alley.
Well, honestly, with this issue of nuclear, it's an issue that affects all of us. And oftentimes when we talk about nuclear, we also have to talk about climate change, because these two issues are linked one way or another. And so, whether that's, joining these marches or joining these types of discussions, learning more, or reaching out to those who are on the front line, all of us share this planet. And so, we all have to do our part to, again, as I mentioned, create that livable planet for all of us.
I'm gonna piggyback right off of what Benedict said, because something that he and his group and other allies did just the other day was in remembering the 67 years they've been dealing with this issue, is brought to light what is a problem for all of us. The young people in there, as they become radiant, as they became, because they could see the light and they were becoming the light. You know what was the factor? Is that they didn't know. To not know is the absence of knowledge. Why didn't they know? Why isn't there that we can't look around and see who's the crown tire crying it out in the town and make sure people know? Who? Are we? Are we part of that? See, these are the things we have to put up on ourselves. If we know that somebody ought to be doing something, that presupposes we know something that could be done. And the question is, why aren't we doing it? We have to face those things that make us shrink ourselves. Part of it, again, it's to culture. This issue we're dealing with, culture is taught, most of it is, this is over your head. You're not ambassador so-and-so, and you're certainly not a scientist, but we are stakeholders, and all stakeholders should be at the meeting and have a vote. In other words, you feel your power. And then, remember that pain I said? Let's say, take utilities for instance. If you're having a problem with utilities and you hear somebody else on the block having the same kind of problem, next thing you know, a bunch of y'all, somewhere in that crying out and fussing, you wind up saying, they order leads to the idea of what could be the new policy that could be done. And if we're listening and caring for each other, we begin to say, yeah. And so if all of us are expressing that, what we ought to have, and standing there together, it begins to form a sense of power. So those are sitting there saying, uh-oh, I better get ready to respond. One way or the other, your power is forming. Now you got to figure out and recognize you got it and how you will use it. Some of it will be to push people in the right direction of policy, and some of it will be from among you to advance someone to serve and helping to create policy from within. We got to think about all of that. And we don't really think about it. Some of us take this organizing as an activity. But anyway, knowledge. Those kids didn't know, and kids all over don't really know.
Okay, do we have any other questions? If not, I will ask another one because I have many. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I will ask mine again, and this will be to both Benedict and Jim. What did you mention generally that, in fact, there's just, this movement has not been diverse for some time. and folks aren't at the table who should be at who we would want to be at the table and we want to be working with. But there does seem to be some sort of acknowledgement in reaching out that this hasn't been the case for some time. What advice would either of you give to any nuclear abolition activists who either wanted to work with the Marshallese community or be an ally to them, or who wanted to start to bring in more BIPOC voices into the movement? Do folks need to acknowledge, hey, I haven't been there for you, or find points of connection? But in doing that, is that being presumptuous? Is that being white splainy? What advice do you have for folks who want to reach out beyond their circle, both of you?
Practice in the room, practice within. That's part of expressing in your core group. You know, I get a little nervous when I go in to communities of color, or someone who is of color saying, yeah, I don't feel, when I go in the white communities, I feel this, because you want to become aware of your unrecognized actions that may even push somebody off. You also want to become aware of your own misthinking that self-shrinks. So I say practice within, those things you think you would experience outside. In fact, take some of those things that we've already heard outside and bring them in the room and role play them to build yourself up and get stronger.
Thank you. And we have some more questions from other folks. So I'm going to go ahead, and first I'm going to read a question from Daniel Jesus Puentes, who says, question for both speakers. Why hasn't there been any specific campaign by major groups to push the US to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty? While the TPNW is in force now, the track that nuclear weapon states will likely follow is to bring the CTBT into force, following by the FMCT and finally the TPNW. And either of you want to address the CTBT?
Leave no question unanswered. Go ahead, Benedict. I'll go with it. Well, it's because the mechanism of standard organizations haven't changed. Remember the changing of the guard, this new energy, this new requirement, and this new push toward, as issues rise, to be ready to move, not be stuck in a box and say, well, we get funding, we'll move on it. You know, that's part of the issue. Right now in communities, they're fighting issues that are important to them. And so some organization that may get paid to work on a particular thing, then they want to get in a fight and pull them, but then it becomes a battle of almost pulling them off target. I say organizations have to figure out how to change to receive this pop-up energy and opportunity and allow this new creativity that's coming in, these new action plans. I mean, the organizations really plan flash mobs. And yet young folks know how to use them. What if we really strategically set them up to do things? I got ideas on it. I won't press it here, but that I'd say it's the changing of the mechanism, both of organization, and then you as being in an organization, being able to speak strong but truthfully.
Great. Benedict, would you like to respond? And then we'll have a question from April and we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so with the previous question about how people can, I guess, be like an ally to the Marshallese community. One of the things that my organization is doing, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, is we're having these classes to educate the community, because, you know, there's a lot of people out there who don't know, again, as Jim mentioned, who don't know about these things. And so I think getting more people to educate them about the pain and the struggles of my community, you know, having more support will then, you know, build up that type of movement where we can then push the U.S. government to say, look, we need to ban nuclear weapons. We need not to build these things anymore because of their destruction on the environment, but also on people.
Thank you. We're time, but I'm going to go over a little bit for those of you who can stay on, because I want to make sure folks get their questions asked. So a question from April who would like to ask it herself. So either you can unmute yourself or can our tech team unmute April?
Yes, hi. I just wanted to know from Benedict if he had any thoughts about what the U.S. government could do to try to counter these unjust policies of the past and present. Just you got Medicaid that was just put back into law. It was an error, and it was just now put back. It was sort of slipped in there because people didn't want to talk about immigration. And saw that it would be pro-immigrant to put Medicaid back in. So, is there anything that the U.S. government, we as a public, could push the U.S. government to do to try to remedy some of these injustices?
Yes, so there are many things that the U.S. government can do. For example, they need to recognize the atrocities they committed in the Marshall Islands.
Yes.
They need to be teaching the history in the classroom across the country. They need to pay for the actual nuclear damage that they caused in the Marshalls. They need to build world-class hospitals in the islands to deal with health disparities from the nuclear testing. They also need to provide medical experts we desperately need. The Marshall Islands doesn't have an oncologist or a cancer doctor, yet we have some of the highest rates of cancer in the world. So these are some things that the US can do.
Great. Stay with us because we have another question for Benedict, and maybe one more, which connects very well, which is, what is the relationship, if any, between immigration policy and the situation of the Marshallese community?
So with the Marshallese, we're able to come here to the United States because of the Compact of Free Association, which is an agreement between the United States and the Marshall Islands that stems from the nuclear legacy. And so the Compact of Free Association allows us to come here for work, for education, to be with family, and many other reasons. But despite that, there's a lot of issues that the compact needs to address. Right now, the compact is being negotiated between the Marshallese government and the Biden administration. We hope that we'll get an agreement that will benefit the Marshallese people.
I have a question from Kathleen, which is, in New York, New York CAN is organizing an action on March 17th, declaring Bayard Rustin Day, his birthday, a great African-American New Yorker. Oh, it's not a question, it's a statement, it's an announcement. So March 17th, folks, if you're in New York, there will be an event on March 17th to celebrate Bayard Rustin Day. Are there any other questions for our speakers today? Sandra, I happen to see you.
I guess I mistakenly sent it to the tech team or something. Anyway, how do we engage people? Because people are tired of the news. People are relaxing because we have a new president, and they're thinking everything is okay. What do we do about all that? And not scare them to death and make them go, oh, Sandra's coming, we can't listen to this.
Either one?
Either one of you. I'm going to say that for her.
Well, I love it. And I'll tell you, here's what, let me answer it this way, and I'll go and I'll finish it up. Think about all the songs that you didn't pick. You didn't necessarily like them. You heard them so much, now you hum them. You know the words, and you didn't even choose them. The point is, our conversation needs to be like the music we hear. We need to be bringing our conversation everywhere, barbershop, beauty shop, in the restaurant, even in some party setting that want to have some healthy talk. I'm just saying we have to get comfortable with blending this emergency moment with the flow of life as it goes. And the reason I say I use that thing about songs, just, imagine doing a flash mob, 15 to 20 minutes, and you're hitting busy corners with people with you handing out some flyers, and you're only there 15 minutes to lay down what the issue is about and why it's important, and you're gone. And maybe you hit another corner, 15 minutes, another one, gone, and call it a day. The point is, it creates what back in the day they call a happening. You go, hey, there was those people in the corner. What was it about? Start getting people curious and wanting to talk. And the more we talk, the more possibilities of others picking it up. That's just one easy way. But the other is going into communities, and I can provide later some ways to connect to different areas. Well, I'll give you this one and shut up. When we talk about gentrification in our communities, think about militarized gentrification as the US tries to set up bases in countries that don't want them. That means they have to displace the people and change the whole dynamics of those countries. When we start making those connections and helping our housing allies understand that our footprint has to be more than this nation, it is worldwide. It's a worldwide struggle.
Thank you. Okay, we are over time, but if you haven't, it looks like we don't have any more questions, so that worked out perfectly. Jim and Benedict, I'm going to ask you guys if you have resources. We're going to be sending out an email to everybody who participated in this webinar, and want to make sure that you all have resources from the earlier presentations and all of today. So please, Jim and Benedict, send me resources, and I will make sure that all of you get them so that you have some homework you can read, some actions you can take, some groups you can join. Oh, he's putting something up there right now. And what is that?
African Americans Against the Bomb, Vincent and Tani. Make sure you get your copy.
Okay. And in a new book on the way. But we'll make sure to get you all materials to follow up. And just thank you so very much for joining us on this critical and central issue for all of us in the movement and the world.